I'm going to talk a little bit about game development. So basically, you've got things like the mini map, and you've got these keys on the bottom that animate, like when you're reloading, and you've got this damage panel on the left. You've got all this stuff over here on the left, and then you got the game, and then you've got the overlay, and you've got the stuff up here at the top. So a bad programmer would render all of this every frame. A good programmer would not. A good programmer would only render uh, the gameplay every frame, and things like the mini map or this damage panel or these other items, you don't render this every frame. If they're rendering the mini map every frame, it's hurting performance and it's not a wise idea. I'm going to give you an example. You could probably update this every 10 frames and the user probably wouldn't notice a difference. And what you would do is you could use a mod function, like you have some sort of a counter with the frame number. Let's say on the Commodore 64, they had something called a Jiffy, and you could measure time passing by in jiffies, which I believe was a nanosecond. I really don't remember. So you find some sort of a counter, and you say, okay, every 10 frames, I'm going to update the minimap. And then you've cut the number of updates by 90%. And the same with the damage panel. And the same with these little icons down here. If they're updating it every frame, it's a mistake. Now, when you make it transparent, you still don't have to update it every frame. I'll explain. What you do is you render the map, and then you save it as a local cache variable. You return from the function. When you call the function again, you have some sort of a timer. And it says how much time has elapsed since the last time I rendered the minimap. If, let's say it's 100 nanoseconds. If it's less than 100 nanoseconds, you return the image that was in the cache, which you rendered last time you called the function. If it's beyond the 100 nanoseconds, you render a new image. And by doing that, you're literally rendering this only 10% of the time. So you'll get 100 frames per second for the main screen, but this will only render 10 frames per second. And same with the damage panel over here. Before, you could do this probably once per second, but now they have little counters, and because of the little counters that they have for damage, they do have to do it a little bit more often. So I'm going to use another example. You see over here it says 10.93 seconds. They have to update this if you have 100 frames per second once per frame. But let's say you got 200 frames per second. If they're updating this on every frame, then they're doing it twice as often as they need to. So again, basically, what a bad programmer would do is they would measure the game based on how quickly they think your computer can perform, as opposed to how much time has elapsed. What I would do is measure how much time has passed, and when a certain amount of time passes, you execute a certain function. For example, you have a loop and it says update this display over here. You almost never have to update. You can probably update it once per second and you'd be fine. The only thing that changes is what? Whether you platoon and whether or not there's a kill. Update this once per second. So you're going to have a function that says if a second has elapsed, when you call this function, it's going to check to see, it's going to have an internal timer that says has a second elapsed. And if it hasn't, you just return a bitmap that was last rendered. If a second has elapsed, you render the new bitmap. Or you could do only render the new bitmap if there's been a change to the data, which means you'd have to keep a copy of the data as it was last patched. Maybe you could do it with a hashtag, with a hash. Another example is, in general, they do something like almost every game says minimum graphics, low, medium, high, maximum. Wrong way to do it. The right way to do it is you're going to have a function that says draw map, which is the terrain, and then draw a vehicle, draw objects. It'll start from the distance and then draw closer to the camera. Draw shadows, draw reflections, draw dirt on tank, draw overlay. What I would do is I would have a timer that says, okay, I want this to be done in 10 nanoseconds, the whole process. If you draw the terrain and 9 nanoseconds elapse, there's no way you're going to complete the whole process. You don't have to have the user select minimum graphics or maximum graphics. What you do is you check how much time has elapsed, and you have a function, and you put everything in the order from lowest graphics to highest graphics, which would be reflections and shadows and things like that. And then you say how much time has passed. If 10 nanoseconds passed, you exit. Then with the next command, if let's say it's draw terrain, if 10 nanoseconds pass, you exit. And then draw objects. If 10 nanoseconds passed, exit. Draw shadows. If 10 nanoseconds passed, exit. Draw reflections. If 10 nanoseconds pass, exit. And then what happens is a fast computer is going to complete the process. A slow computer is not going to. It's only going to do a few stages. And when the player rotates the map, it's not going to complete drawing. So what will happen is as he rotates, the shadows might disappear, the reflections might disappear. When he stops, all of a sudden it's going to start drawing shadows again. As he moves, the shadows might disappear. And when you do it, it's dynamic. And that's how I did all of my video games. Now, obviously, there is a problem. You could get flicker. You could get the shadows constantly turning on and off. So you do have to put a little bit of a delay that says only change the level of rendering, let's say once per second or once every 5 seconds or something like that. But then that means there could be some stuttering in the game. The game might slow down. But that's how you do like the dynamic graphics, and you do it for everything. By doing that, you will get a better performance because now the user is no longer making the mistake of setting the graphics too high or too low. The game is actually deciding in real time how much graphics to draw. So another example is chat. You're doing 100 frames per second. You don't need to update the chat 100 frames per second. We have to do it once per second. So when you call the chat routine, if it's been called within the last second, if 1 second has not elapsed on the internal timer, you just return whatever you previously had stored. When 1 second passes, that's when you update the chat. That's the way I would do it. But, these guys, they're going to do it their way. They have legacy code. They got to do it the way the code was written. It's going to also apply to other aspects of the game, like hitting a key on the keyboard. If the game is 100 frames per second, you don't need to be checking the keyboard. Certain keys, like the V key, you don't need to react to it 100 frames per second. The V key that removes all this stuff, if you're checking at 50 frames per second, nobody's going to notice. They're not going to care. In general, user input, you're probably going to check it frequently. I don't know. Yeah, that there's going to be other aspects to the game. But what I say is definitely true. It does work. I do believe it is the better way. You do need to practice fine-tuning it. You do need to rework the way you do your code. You have to do everything in a specific order from highest priority to lowest priority. Doing reflections would be considered low priority. It's not necessary for the game, but the terrain is necessary for the game. I don't know if there's any other examples. I think that's about it. The other thing you do, let's say you're rotating. When you rotate, you keep a copy of where you came from. So when you rotate back in the other direction, you just pull it from the cache. You don't do the calculations all over again. And the same with going forward and backwards. If you go forward, you keep a copy of where you were the last, let's say, 20 frames. So when you reverse, you don't have to redo all the calculations for all the positioning on the map. You just pull it all from memory. And it's lightning fast. The frames per second would shoot up if it's pulling from the cache. The only time you'd have low frames per second is if you're rendering something new. So the question is, depending on how much memory you have, determines how much you can cache. You might be able to go all the way to this rock, cache it all. I don't know how much memory it would take. Because it's a 3D game and you could rotate in any direction, it could destroy your cache. It could defeat your cache. We'll call it defeating the cache. But if you're just hitting the W key, S key, W key, S key, the cache method would work. Or if you're just hitting A and D, which of course almost never happens, maybe for tank destroyers it would happen. If you're hitting A, D, caching all the terrains and all the objects is a smart idea, and it improves performance, and it allows you to do other things with better performance. I'm going to use another example with spotting. You can spot 445 meters. You don't have to check that every frame. What vehicle is so fast that in one frame it can run across your view? It can't happen. So you don't have to check the 445 meters every frame. Maybe you could check every 3 frames or every 5 frames. Or maybe what you do is you check every 50 meters every frame. Every 300 meters you check every 3 frames. Every 445 meters you check every 5 frames, or something like that. Depending on how many frames have gone by, determines the distance you check. And then what happens is you're still doing a pretty good job checking for spotting, but it allows the game more time to do more important things, such as updating the graphical display. And then what will happen is a slower computer will have prettier graphics, because you cut all the cycles out from all these things that you're rendering that you don't need to do. You don't need to render these menus over and over again. Guess how often you have to update the counter? Once per second. You don't. If it's 100 frames per second, you don't need to update the counter 100 times per second. And the same with the ping time. So I'm gonna guess. Also, like things like these loader bars, they could be calculating it. Doesn't that make sense to you? They probably got a routine that calculates, I'm going to fill in this much, I'm going to fill in 40%, I'm going to fill in 50%. You only got to do it once, and then you render it, save it all in memory. And then every time you reload, you just pull the 40%, pull it from memory. And then you don't have to keep on doing it over. Or you make it, like an animated GIF. You make all the frames and you just animate through it. You don't have to do the calculations. If you do it as a pre-rendered set of frames, you're probably going to get better performance. Same with every aspect. I don't know if there's anything else that is relevant. Okay, so that's my opinion. If you have any questions or comments or any other ideas on how to improve performance, please post below.